In continuation with our lectures on animal behavior, today I want to talk about movement ecology. Movement affects ecological systems in many ways. I've already shown you this figure before that describes the dispersion of individuals, meaning the spacing with respect to one another. And I talked about this figure when we were discussing competition and how species that compete versus species that don't would have different dispersion patterns. Today I want you to think about this figure in light of dispersal, which is the movement of individuals from their place of birth or places of high population density. Dispersal can influence dispersion of animals within a system or within their environment. Movement can happen at many different spatial and temporal scales. And we have to think about animal movement or plant movement in terms of individuals or propagules that are shifting locations in the environment. And this has consequences for ecological processes as well as evolutionary patterns. So let's think about movement at spatial scales. This can be local or small, meaning animals move within their home range or move within a small area. Or it can be large. Animals or plants can move globally, either being carried by wind or by a vector or flying themselves. Movement can also be thought about at different temporal scales. Within a day, for example, when an organism wakes up in the morning, goes out, forages and returns, that movement is all happening within a day. Can also happen within a lifetime or across multiple generations. So you can imagine propagules of a plant or individuals of a species shifting their home ranges and therefore their geographical distributions over multiple generations. And that's still considered movement. Movement can be directional or non-directional. Can be unidirectional or bidirectional. So for example, you could have dispersion happen in one direction where an animal moves from point A to point B and then stays there, or it can be bidirectional, which is what we usually think about when we consider migration. So what influences animal movement? So we're thinking about animal movement first, and then we'll talk about plant movement. So animal movement has to be thought about at the individual level because it's the individual that's moving. And there have been lots of research to understand what motivates movement and how movement is done. And so I take this list now that I'm going to describe to you from what is called the movement ecology paradigm. So at the individual level, we have to think about an animal's navigational capacity. So it's cognitive or sensory machinery that it uses to obtain and use information in the environment. And they use this information so their navigational capacity allows them to orient in space and time. It's the navigational capacity that influences where and when an animal should move. We should also think about an animal's motion capacity. Right? So these are biomechanical, morphological traits that enable an animal to actually move. So how fast it can run or how long it can run, whether it can fly or swim. Right? So actually it's how to move. The internal state of the animal matters. Right? Whether males or females are the ones who move, or how old you are when you move. Maybe it's juveniles that disperse, or it's adults that leave. Your physiological condition, for example, if you're healthy, you can move farther than if you're not. So internal state influences why you're moving and who moves. And finally, there's external factors, which is the biotic and abiotic environment that the individual is interacting with. So landscape features, for example, can either enhance or impede movement. Predators, conspecifics, prey, all have different influences in which direction and how far an animal would move. So for example, you'd expect a prey to move away from predators, or conspecifics to find each other during the breeding season, or predators to seek out prey. These are external factors that influence the nature of the animal movement. Now, let's focus on why animals or organisms move. There's lots of reasons. So the external factors that I described just a minute ago is what we'll expand on in this slide. So, for example, organisms move through space and time to reduce competition with either their parent or conspecifics. So when we talked about competition before, animal and plant movement fits well here. So plant dispersal, for example, is propagules of a plant moving away from the parent, and they do that to reduce competition. Organisms could move to obtain food or mates or avoid predators. To establish, which means to live or reproduce in a new area. So this could be because of competition, or it could be because life stages change their habitat requirements. So for example, frogs, many frogs are terrestrial, while tadpoles are aquatic. And so they have to move from one environment to another. Sometimes animals are moving to get away from conspecifics to avoid inbreeding. Animals and plants also move to avoid harsh conditions. So for example, long-distance seasonal migration is why some animals move away from their habitat that they're in right now because of winter to go to new breeding habitats or refuge habitats. So among these very many reasons that animals move, we can consider how the environment shapes this. And later in the course, you'll hear about climate change and you'll hear about anthropogenic pressures on animal movement. And I want to give you an example from a recent paper that has just demonstrated that human disturbances influence animal movements. And so in this paper, the authors tracked animals or pulled data from studies that tracked animals in areas with and without disturbance. And they see that how far an animal moves changes as a function of whether or not there's a human disturbance. So for example, amphibians reduce their movement distance in the presence of human disturbance. So that's values here that are lower than 0. Some animals, like arthropods, increase their movement in the presence of human disturbance. Reptiles, for example, reduce it. Fish are somewhere in between. Now, why would human disturbance influence animal movement? Well, human disturbances in the landscape alter all sorts of things about the environment. They alter the structure as well as the resource and competition associated with that environment. So if we think about human disturbance in terms of the different types of disturbances, we see some really interesting patterns here. For example, habitat fragmentation affects birds and insects in the same way. They have to increase their movement or increase their home range size in these environments. Grazing causes an increase in movement distances as well. And pollution causes an increase in movement distance. So we can think about human disturbance in terms of how it's changing the abiotic environment. So for example, fragmentation is breaking up the natural habitat, at which point birds and insects need to use a larger area to get the resources they require. Pollution, for example, does the same thing. Right? Negatively affects the environment, at which point fish need to use a larger area to either get away from the pollution or to seek out resources in areas without pollution. There are some interesting opposite effects. So for example, urbanization reduces movement distances of animals of various sizes. And it's been understood that urbanization does two things to the environment. What it can do is fragment the habitat so that there are small patches, at which point animals can't move across the urbanized environment. it can also bring in all these food and resources that humans have put in the environment. And so now animals can have smaller home ranges and get more resources because they're using human-derived foods. So animal movement is a dynamic response of the organism and the environment. So when the environment changes, the organism responds as well. And so here we see how human-induced impacts of the environment can shift how much space an animal uses. I want to think of two special cases of movement. So far, with the example that I just showed you, we were thinking about movement within a home range or within a territory of the animal. And so we're considering things like its local dynamics, predator-prey interactions at that scale, or competition at that scale. But dispersal and migration are two special cases of movement that are usually long distances. So when we think of dispersal, what we must understand is that it's the movement away from the birthplace or away from where the animal originated. Migration, on the other hand, is travel in a period that is geographically predictable. Right? So either animals move at a time that is predictable or across space that's predictable. Unlike dispersal, when we think of migration, everyone in the population moves. Dispersal doesn't necessarily need to be that way. Some animals can move, some animals don't have to. Some plants or some plant propagules can move, and some don't have to. Now, plants and animals that disperse or migrate evolve traits that allow them to move. We'll talk about these traits in just a minute. Given that it's an organism that's moving through space, of course there are going to be barriers to movement. Some of those barriers could be physiological. So for example, a terrestrial organism cannot swim over long distances during migration. There could be ecological barriers that are geographical, for example. There could be behavioral barriers, right? So organisms may not necessarily cross areas that have competition from new species or high predation. Right? So there are some barriers to this movement, and this influences where an organism ends up and how it gets there. I want to think about seeds as a special case of dispersal, because seeds have evolved a whole range of adaptations that allow them to move. And we begin with the fact that seeds are coated by fruits, and fruits have evolved for a single purpose, which is seed dispersal. Some of this that I'm about to present here may be a revision for you, but it's important because it influences where seeds and plants end up. So we can think about seed dispersal in terms of the different modes, right? How they move through space. So one of the most common one is wind dispersed seeds. So if you're a wind dispersed seeds, you are lightweight, you may have wing-like appendages or parachute-like structures. And so you've evolved these traits, or seeds that are wind dispersed have evolved these traits in order to be carried long distances. Water dispersed traits evolve fruits that float, so coconut for example, right? And so aquatic angiosperms or shore-dwelling plants evolve fruits that can float, and so therefore they're carried by currents to new locations from when they drop. Animal dispersals or zoochroic can come in two forms. They can be ectozoochroy, which is seeds that have structures or fruits that have structures that stick to the fur, or if you're a human, clothes of a passing animal. Right? So an animal dispersed seed that is attached will be carried as far as the vector goes. There's also animal dispersal that is via ingestion, right? So this is endozoochroy. Now, fruits that have evolved for animal dispersal create outer coatings that are edible, and so therefore they're carried by foragers. There are two categories of ingested fruits. One is when the fruit is carried in the gut or the seeds are carried in the gut of animals, and so therefore carried until they're passed out. Another, like some seeds, some acorns, for example, are buried by animals, and the idea here is that those seeds that are forgotten by those animals are the ones that end up germinating. And then finally, there are two others. There's self-dispersal, autochory, where the fruits that disperse themselves. So, for example, peanuts bury their own seeds. And finally, there's ballistic, fruits that open explosively to expel seeds that are then dispersed in the environment. So here's an image of three different types of fruits and seeds. So the first one is dandelion seeds that are dispersed by wind. In B is a coconut seed that's dispersed by water. And in C is acorns that are dispersed at animals that cache them, which means they bury them places and then forget it. So you can see all three of these fruit and seed types are structurally different, which means they've evolved adaptations to enable them to be dispersed from where they were formed to a new environment. So how far can seeds be dispersed? Well, that depends on the vector that's carrying them. And so you can see from this cartoon image here that some seeds fall to the ground via gravity. The seeds from the same plant can be carried by birds a further distance, and that's through endochory, through the gut. Seeds can be carried by mammals on the ground, right? And that can go also either endochory or ectochory. Seeds can be carried by insects as well. And of course, the various distances that they go depend on who's carrying them, right? So, if it's wind dispersed, it could be carried further than if it was animal dispersed, right? Especially if the animal that's dispersing it is a small animal. Humans can also disperse seeds depending on the type of fruit that is associated with those seeds. That's harder to predict because human travel distances vary. Now, why does it matter how far seeds can be dispersed? I'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about how we know how far seeds disperse. So there are lots of methods for us to understand the dispersal kernel of seeds, which is how far they go from the parent tree. One is you can set up seed traps, right, which are traps across distances away from a tree, and it will measure or it will collect seeds at different distances. Right? And this would be an example of seeds that have been either carried by animals or carried by wind or carried by gravity or dropped by gravity. You can also understand the gut passage time of birds or mammals that are carrying these seeds and incorporate that information into understanding how far an edible seed travels. You can combine the gut passage time information with movement data to know how far a seed can travel. You can also do scat sampling. So if you collect scat in a systematic way away from parent trees, you can see how much of the seed of that parent tree or that species is found in space, across space. And finally, you can genetically analyze seedlings across an area away from a parent tree to see whether those seedlings are related to their parent. And then that will tell you how far the seed has traveled in order for that seedling to grow in that environment. Now, a combination of all these methods is what ecologists use to determine how far seeds go. And this matters because it allows us to calculate or determine the dispersal kernel of seeds. So a combination of all these different vectors can influence the distribution of seeds away from parent plants, and therefore not only influence the dispersal of seeds, but the dispersion of plants in the environment, with meaning how spaced out they are. So now that we've talked about dispersal, let's think about migration. Now, migration is one of the longest distance movements that animals make. And migration is different from other forms of movement because it involves traveling from one habitat to another at a really broad scale. Of course, you can have movement within a home range that crosses different habitats, right? So movement within a day or within a season that also moves from one habitat to another. But migration takes animals from one habitat to another where they stay for some time before returning to the original habitat. So it can be across really large distances, like across continents from north to south or east to west. It can be complex round trips across land and ocean. It could be altitudinal movement up and down mountains. It could be vertical movement through the water column of oceans and lakes. And taxa as diverse as fish, crustaceans, amphibians, reptiles, insects, mammals, and even slime molds migrate. I want to give you a few really interesting examples of migration. One is humpback whales that travel up to 8,500 kilometers each way. And they go from their breeding grounds to their feeding grounds and back every year. Right. The monarch butterfly, up to 4,750 kilometers in a single season, in the autumn season. Right. And whole populations of monarch butterflies move in these large groups. The most extreme example of migration that we have on Earth is the Arctic tern that travels 80,000 kilometers round trip. The Arctic tern breeds in the northern hemisphere in that area I've highlighted in red there. It goes down to the southern hemisphere when the north hemisphere is in winter, and then it comes right back up at the end. So every 6 months, the Arctic tern makes this trip back and forth, and it's the longest distance travel. In India, we have several interesting examples, and here's one. Leatherback turtles, which breed in the Andaman Islands over a several-month period, have been known to travel all the way to either Africa or Australia. And so you see these lines here. These are tracks of individually tagged female leatherback turtles. And after a couple of years in these new areas, they return to the Bay of Bengal and to the islands to breed again. And the reason they go to the southern hemisphere of Africa and Australia is because they feed on jellyfish, which are easily found in the warmer waters. So now that I've given you some examples of movement across various scales, right? Movement within a home range, movement that is dispersal, that's unidirectional, migration that goes back and forth, why are ecologists interested in animal and plant movement? Is an important question. So if we think about the number of animals that disperse, that influences population size, right? How many organisms how many propagules, or how many animals that move from one area to the next influences the population size of the natal area, also influences the population size at the destination. Movement in and out of areas can influence population growth. Right? Who stays behind and who goes affects who's breeding and how the population can grow. So movement influences these metrics that are necessary for us to understand ecological processes in an environment. Individual and population movement can influence community composition, because if you imagine scenarios where you've got migrating organisms going from one area to the other, it influences how the species that are left behind, it influences the species that they interact with at the destination. And so community composition is affected by individual and population movement. And that influences trophic interactions, for example. So think about the wildebeest migration in Serengeti National Park, where large herds of wildebeest and zebra move across the landscape for hundreds of kilometers. As they move, they're increasing the foraging pressure on the environment at all the locations that they're stopping at. And so the interactions between the wildebeest and the plants, right, their foraging ecology, is going to shift the ecosystem dynamics of that environment, right, as they move through space. So movement is a strong component of ecological processes. Same thing with migration. Right? Migratory animals affect biodiversity at local and global scales, where they are and across the entire space. It can affect things like trophic interactions. So migratory animals, because they're consumers, competitors, and prey, they impact local biomass and have trophic effects on resident species and ecosystems. They have transport effects. So migratory animals transport nutrients, energy, disease, and other materials. So that can impact disease dynamics of both the migratory and the resident species. It can affect ecosystem processes. So migratory animals impact nutrient cycle and primary productivity at all the locations that they stop at. With that, I want to end our discussion about movement with two things to think about. I want you to think about what ways climate change will affect the movement of animals and plants. So how will climate change affect the daily or seasonal movement of animals and plants? Will climate change affect dispersal and the dispersal kernels, for example, dispersal distances? Will it affect migration? And if so, in what way? What consequences will shifted movement, so these changes, have on community ecology and ecosystems? Well, I said in the last two slides that it would affect them, but I want you to think deeply about what would happen if climate change shifted dispersal distances, for example, or shifted migration patterns. How would that affect community ecology and ecosystems? With that, we'll end our discussion of movement ecology.